One day in the spring of 2006, a detective stood next to a refrigerator inside her local police station, holding a container of evidence that had been sitting there for months. She knew that what she was about to do with this evidence was a complete breach of police protocol and could easily get her fired, suspended, or in serious trouble with her superiors. But she did not care. She believed that a killer was walking free, and she was willing to risk her entire career to bring them to justice. But before we get into that, let us look at how this incredibly tense situation actually began. On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, Dr. John Yelnick finished up his very last dental patient of the day. He was a dentist in the quiet rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. John was a handsome, friendly man who was deeply respected by everyone in his town. As he finished up his final exam, he handed his patient a brand new toothbrush, flashed his signature warm smile, and told her to make sure she came back in 6 months for her next routine cleaning. Once she walked out, John went back into his private office, packed up his briefcase, and walked out through the front lobby. He waved to his receptionist and told her to have an absolutely great night. She smiled back, waved, and wished him a good evening. But the moment John stepped outside his office building and the heavy door clicked shut behind him, the warm smile completely vanished from his face. The truth was, John was incredibly exhausted, and pretending to be happy all day long for his patients was becoming harder and harder. He had a mountain of personal and financial problems weighing on his shoulders, and he felt like he was running out of time. John walked across the gravel parking lot, climbed into his car, and started the short half-mile drive from his dental office to his home. John had actually grown up in this small, tight-knit town of Blairsville, and his dream had always been to raise a family right here. After graduating from dental school 13 years earlier, his classmates had all rushed off to big cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia to make their fortunes. But John decided to return home. He joined the practice of his own childhood dentist in downtown Blairsville, and it turned out to be a fantastic decision. John was incredibly charming, kind, and possessed a natural gift for calming down nervous children. Because of this, his dental practice became incredibly successful, and he started making a lot of money. Instead of spending it on luxury cars or expensive clothes, John decided to invest his extra earnings into local real estate. He bought up rental properties and apartment buildings, and by the time he was in his late 30s, John was officially a self-made millionaire. But despite all of his wealth, John felt like something was missing from his life. He wanted a family of his own. That was when he met a woman named Michelle. Michelle was a single mother with 2 young children, and to John, this was absolutely perfect. He loved children and was thrilled at the idea of getting a ready-made family to love and support. John's friends and family members were a bit worried when the couple first started dating. They knew John had a lot of money, and they were concerned that Michelle was only interested in his bank account. But John did not care about the gossip. And then, a major event happened that completely erased any doubts John had about Michelle's intentions. John's mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. It was an incredibly painful and difficult time for John, but Michelle did not hesitate to help. She stepped up and became his mother's full-time caregiver, spending countless days and nights by her bedside, keeping her comfortable and managing her medical needs. To John, this was all the proof he would ever need that Michelle was a deeply caring person who truly loved him and his family. They got married in 1997, and shortly after, they adopted a baby boy named JJ. They were a happy family of 5, and they moved into a massive, gorgeous house with a beautiful swimming pool and a luxury hot tub in the back. But as John pulled his car into the driveway of his current home, he just sat there staring at the house, feeling incredibly depressed. The house he was living in now was not the grand mansion with the pool. It was a very small, modest rental house on a quiet street. He sat in his car and wondered how his perfect life had fallen apart so completely. John was currently facing severe financial stress. Despite being a millionaire on paper, most of his money was tied up in real estate, and he had loaned tens of thousands of dollars to various friends and neighbors who were struggling. Now, John's cash flow was dangerously low, and he was having to go around asking people to pay him back, which was incredibly stressful and uncomfortable. But his financial problems were nothing compared to his marital problems. His marriage to Michelle had entered a horrible, dark phase that they simply could not recover from. Both John and Michelle had eventually admitted to having affairs, and the relationship was completely over. They were now living in separate houses, which was why John was staying in this small rental home instead of the big family mansion. But even the financial and marital stress paled in comparison to the third major stressor in John's life. John was absolutely convinced that someone was trying to murder him. This terrifying belief had started about 2 weeks earlier when John walked out to his car and discovered that someone had heavily vandalized it with spray paint. The local police had investigated the incident, but because there were no security cameras or witnesses, they had no leads. John knew that a vandalized car did not automatically mean someone wanted to kill him, but he had a powerful, unshakable gut feeling that this was highly personal and targeted. He felt like someone was actively stalking him. The fear was so intense that John had actually gone to his attorney's office and handed her $10,000 in cash. He told her that if he ended up dead, she was to use that money to hire private investigators to find out who killed him. John finally got out of his car, walked up the steps of his front porch, and went inside his quiet rental home. He shut the heavy wooden door and locked it behind him. The silence in the house was deafening and depressing. He wished his adopted son JJ was there with him because the young boy always brought so much life and energy into the home, but these days, because of the separation, John only got to see JJ during scheduled visits, and he had not seen his son in quite a while. John kicked off his shoes and walked into his living room. There, lying on the wooden coffee table, was a thick stack of legal documents that he had been trying his best to ignore. They were divorce papers. Michelle had first filed for divorce 3 years earlier in 2003, but the process had dragged on because they were locked in a bitter custody battle over JJ. Michelle wanted sole custody of the boy, but John refused to give up his rights to his son. But John knew that in less than 24 hours, this painful chapter of his life would finally be over. Their attorneys had eventually negotiated a shared custody agreement that both sides could accept. Michelle had already signed her part of the paperwork, and tomorrow morning, John was scheduled to sign his name, finalizing the custody deal. John sat down on his couch, turned on the television to distract himself, but he was far too restless to focus on any of the shows. He decided to call his aunt, who was one of his closest confidants. They spoke for a long time about the impending divorce, the custody agreement, and how relieved John was that the legal battle was finally coming to an end. After they said their goodbyes, John hung up the phone, stretched out on his comfortable living room couch, and quickly fell fast asleep. The very next day, which was Thursday, April 13th, 2006, a 9-year-old boy named Zach Hughes, who lived right next door to John, walked out of his family's front door at around 3:30 in the afternoon. Zach wanted to see if his friend JJ was home and wanted to come outside to play. Zach knew that JJ split his time between his mother's house and John's house, so he was not sure if JJ would actually be there, but he figured it was worth a quick walk next door to check. But as Zach walked up the front steps of John's porch, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. He noticed that the small glass panel located directly to the left of the front door was completely shattered. Shards of glass were scattered across the porch floor. And when Zach looked closer, he saw several dark red dried streaks dripping down the wall beneath the broken window pane. Immediately, Zach felt a rush of absolute terror. He was just a little boy, but he knew what blood looked like, and this dried red liquid looked exactly like blood. His immediate instinct was to turn around and run back to his parents' house as fast as he could. But then he thought about his friend JJ, and he began to worry that JJ or John might be in serious trouble inside. He knew he could not just run away without checking on them. Gathering every bit of courage he had, Zach slowly and nervously climbed the rest of the porch steps. He reached out and tried the front doorknob, but the door was locked. He looked at the shattered glass panel to the left of the door, and very carefully, making sure not to cut himself on the sharp edges, Zach reached his small arm through the broken opening. He reached inside, found the lock mechanism on the door, and turned it. The lock clicked open. Zach slowly pushed the front door open and took a step inside the house. The moment he stepped into the foyer, his eyes widened in horror. Legal papers were scattered all over the floor, and lying in the middle of the hallway was a motionless body, completely covered in dark red blood. Zach did not take another step. He spun around, ran out of the house, leaped off the porch, and sprinted back home to tell his parents. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Lade of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was off duty, driving in her car with her husband and their 4 children. Suddenly, her police radio crackled to life. The dispatcher reported that a call had come in from a quiet residential street in Blairsville. The details were incredibly brief and somewhat confusing. The dispatcher stated that there was an active cardiac arrest situation at a home, and they needed Corporal Lade to head to the scene immediately. Because the call was described as a standard medical emergency, Lade did not think much of it. She figured it was a routine heart attack and that she would just assist the medical team. Since her family was already in the car with her, she decided to drive straight to the address, intending to quickly handle the situation. But the moment Corporal Lade pulled her vehicle up to the front of the house, she knew this was not a normal heart attack. She saw a local patrol officer standing on the front porch, and his face was completely pale and grim. Lade opened her car door, walked up the steps, and asked the officer what was going on. He did not say much. He simply pointed to the shattered glass panel and the dark red stains on the porch floor. He looked at Lade and said that it was probably best if she just went inside and looked for herself. Lade turned around, waved to her husband and kids in the car to let them know everything was fine and that she would be just a minute, and then she pushed open the front door and stepped into the house. The sight that met her was absolutely overwhelming. The entire front foyer was splattered with blood. It was on the floor, the walls, and even the ceiling. Lying in the center of the room, surrounded by scattered white paper, was the most heavily mutilated body she had ever seen in her entire life. Lade had been a police officer for a long time, but she had never actually worked a homicide case before. As she stood there, trying and failing to count the dozens of deep stab wounds covering the victim's chest, neck, and arms, she knew this was definitely not a cardiac arrest. This was a brutal, violent murder, and it was officially her very first homicide investigation. A wave of panic washed over Lade as she realized the gravity of the situation. Because the call had been misreported as a heart attack, the police department had not sent a full emergency response. There was no perimeter set up, and no detectives were on the scene. It was just her and one patrol officer. She realized that the killer or killers could still be hiding inside the house or lurking in the backyard. Even worse, her husband and her 4 children were sitting right outside in the car, completely unprotected. Led quickly instructed the patrol officer to draw his weapon and perform a sweep of the entire house to ensure it was empty. Then, she ran back outside to the front yard, placing her hand firmly on the gun in her holster, standing guard between her family's car and the crime scene. Within a few minutes, the comforting sound of sirens filled the air as backup units and emergency vehicles began arriving at the scene. At the same time, the patrol officer walked out of the front door and told Lade that the house was completely clear. The killer was gone. But the officer had made another grim discovery. He told her that there was a massive pool of blood in the basement of the house. The victim had bled so heavily on the first floor that the blood had actually seeped through the floorboards and dripped down into the basement below. Lad let out a breath of relief, walked over to her husband's car, told him to take the kids and go home, and then she turned back toward the house, fully shifting into detective mode. It was around this time that another officer on the scene walked up to Lade and told her the identity of the victim. His name was Dr. John Yelnick. As the crime scene technicians began to arrive and set up their equipment to process the physical evidence, Lade began a slow, careful walk through each room of the house, trying to piece together what had happened. John's body was lying close to the front door, but it was incredibly obvious that the struggle that led to his death had been long, chaotic, and extremely violent. There was a trail of blood leading from the living room into the hallway. The living room floor was covered in blood splatters and scattered custody documents. John was barefoot, but as Lade looked closely at the floor, she saw several distinct, bloody shoe prints. These prints were far too large to belong to the 9-year-old neighbor boy, Zach, who had discovered the body. Lade knew these prints belonged to the killer, and she immediately had the technicians measure them to determine the shoe size and brand. As Lade continued her walkthrough, she kept an eye out for anything that could have been used as a weapon, but she did not find a knife or any other sharp object. She also checked for signs of a robbery, but everything of value was still in place. The television was sitting on the stand, John's wallet was nearby, and no drawers or cabinets had been ransacked. This confirmed Lade's suspicion that this was not a robbery gone wrong. This was a targeted, highly personal attack. The killer had entered the home with one single goal: to murder John Yelnick in the most brutal way possible. Lade walked back into the living room where the struggle seemed to have started. As she examined the coffee table, she noticed a slip of paper sitting right next to the divorce documents. It was a check made out to John Yelnick for $15,000. Attached to the check was a small handwritten note from someone named Melissa, asking John to please wait a few days before depositing the check into his bank account. When Lade saw the last name on the check, she immediately realized that Melissa had the exact same last name as the young boy next door, Zach Hughes. This meant that the neighbor's mother owed John a massive amount of money, and apparently she could not afford to pay it back all at once. Suddenly, Lade had her first 2 major leads: a highly contentious divorce custody battle and a neighbor who owed the victim a large sum of money that they were struggling to repay. By the time Lade stepped back out onto the front porch, the sun was beginning to set. A large crowd of neighbors, local residents, and reporters had gathered behind the police tape at the edge of the property. Blairsville was a very safe, peaceful community, and a murder like this was completely unheard of. Lade knew that the media pressure was going to be intense, and she would have to handle it carefully. But before she could even walk down the porch steps to head back to the station, another officer walked up to her with some incredibly important updates. During the afternoon, officers had been canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, and speaking to residents to see if anyone had heard or seen anything unusual during the night. They had come back with 2 very promising witness statements. The first statement came from a woman living nearby who said that she had been jolted awake around 1:30 in the morning by the sound of a terrifying, blood-curdling scream coming from the direction of John's house. She said she sat up in bed and listened closely, but the screaming stopped, so she assumed it was just kids playing or a wild animal, and she went back to sleep. The second statement came from another neighbor who lived close by. This neighbor also reported being awakened around 1:30 in the morning by the sound of a loud, angry argument. He said he could hear a man shouting at the top of his lungs. While he could not make out every single word, there was one sentence that the man screamed very clearly: "I will never loan you money again." When Lade heard this, her mind immediately flashed back to the $15,000 check sitting on the living room coffee table. It seemed highly likely that the argument was about that very debt, and that money was indeed the motive for this horrific crime. But the officer was not done. He looked at Lade and told her that several neighbors had mentioned a rumor going around the community. They claimed that John Yelnick and his next-door neighbor, Melissa Fuse, had been having a secret, passionate affair. The very next morning, Friday, April 14th, Corporal Lead was sitting in an interrogation room at the police station. Sitting across from her were Melissa Fuse and her husband, Tom. Even though this was Lead's very first homicide investigation, she was a very analytical and careful investigator, and she had a specific strategy in mind. She knew that in almost every murder case, the primary suspects are always the spouse and their new partner. In this case, that meant John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle, and her new boyfriend, Kevin Foley. The night before, Lade had sent an officer to Michelle's house to break the news of John's death. When the officer arrived, Michelle already knew John was dead, but she claimed she had heard he died of a sudden heart attack. When the officer informed her and Kevin that John had actually been brutally murdered, both of them appeared to be completely shocked. The situation was incredibly complicated for Lade because Michelle's boyfriend, Kevin Foley, was a Pennsylvania State Police trooper. He was a fellow law enforcement officer, and Lade had actually worked with him on several cases in the past. Investigating a fellow cop for murder was an absolute minefield, and Lade knew she had to tread very carefully. She did not want to accuse Kevin or Michelle without having solid evidence first. So her plan was to first interview the neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use, to see if she could rule them out as suspects, and then gather as much information as possible before confronting Kevin and Michelle. Lade looked at Melissa and asked her about the $15,000 check found on John's coffee table. Melissa was visibly shaking, and her voice was incredibly quiet and nervous. She explained that she and John had been very close friends since they were in the 9th grade. She had recently decided to open a small bakery in town, and John, being a generous friend, had loaned her $15,000 to help cover the startup costs. But then, out of nowhere, John had suddenly contacted her and demanded that she return the money immediately. Melissa said she was disappointed because she really needed the funds for her business, but she also knew that John was going through a highly expensive and stressful divorce, so she understood why he needed the cash back. She explained that she only had $14,000 in her account at the time, which was why she wrote the check but attached the note asking him to wait a few days until she could transfer the remaining $1,000 into her account. Lade watched Melissa's body language closely. She seemed genuinely devastated by John's death, and her explanation about the money seemed reasonable. But then, Lade decided to address the rumor head-on. She looked directly at Melissa and asked if she had been having an affair with John. Melissa's face immediately flushed red, and she adamantly denied it, insisting they were just close childhood friends and nothing more. Lade then turned her attention to Melissa's husband, Tom, who was sitting quietly next to his wife. She asked Tom if he believed his wife was having an affair with a neighbor. Tom went completely silent. He stared down at the table, his hands trembling. When he finally spoke, he did not sound angry or defensive. Instead, he seemed incredibly anxious. He refused to answer the question and kept repeating that he was very busy and really needed to leave the station so he could go home and take care of his kids. Tom's extremely nervous reaction and his absolute refusal to answer the question about the affair immediately raised massive red flags for Lade. She let the couple leave, but in her mind, Tom Hughes had just become a major person of interest. He had a clear motive: jealousy over a suspected affair and anger over a large debt. Before she left the station for the evening, Lade met with the officer she had sent to attend John's autopsy. The officer handed her the medical examiner's preliminary findings. The forensic pathologist had determined that John had been attacked with a single-edged blade, and he had been slashed and stabbed dozens of times. During the violent struggle, John's head had been pushed through a glass panel, and a shard of glass had severed his jugular vein, causing him to bleed to death in minutes. John also had deep defensive wounds on his palms and fingers, and multiple cuts on his back, proving that he had fought desperately for his life and had even tried to run away from his attacker. The sheer number of wounds and the level of violence indicated a deep personal hatred. Lade knew that whoever did this really hated John Yelnick. Lade felt confident that she could solve this case if she was allowed to work at her own pace. She was a methodical detective who liked to double-check every single lead. But the problem was, the media was having a field day with the story. The town of Blairsville was demanding answers, and there was massive pressure on the police department to make a quick arrest. Lade knew that if she moved too slowly, her superiors might take the case away from her and hand it over to a larger agency like the state police, but she refused to rush and risk making a mistake. The officer who had attended the autopsy had brought back several critical pieces of physical evidence, including John's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and tissue samples. Under standard police protocol, Lead was required to package these samples and send them immediately to the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab for DNA testing. But Lead made a sudden, highly controversial decision. She decided not to send the samples to the state lab. Instead, she walked over to the evidence refrigerator in the station, placed the container inside, shut the door, and went home. She was intentionally withholding the primary physical evidence in a major homicide investigation. The next day, Saturday, April 15th, Lead decided to visit John's dental practice to speak with his coworkers. She wanted to get a better sense of his relationship with his ex-wife, Michelle. The moment she sat down with the dental hygienist and the receptionist, she realized she had made the right decision. The staff at the dental office had nothing but terrible things to say about Michelle. They explained that during the 3-year custody battle, Michelle had made John's life an absolute living hell. At one point, she had even filed false police reports accusing John of physically abusing their adopted son, JJ. Michelle's own family members did not believe her claims, and Child Protective Services eventually ruled the allegations completely unfounded. But Michelle did not stop there. She had once accused John of violating a restraining order and had the police come to his dental office and arrest him right in front of his staff and patients. The receptionist also revealed that Michelle was constantly calling the office, screaming and demanding that John send her more money. John, who hated conflict, usually caved to her demands and wrote her checks just to keep her quiet. But according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called the office just a few days before the murder, screaming for money as usual. But this time, John had finally reached his breaking point. He told his staff that he was not going to take her calls anymore, and he refused to speak to her. John's friends had also confirmed that Michelle was incredibly materialistic and money-hungry. She was the one who insisted on buying the massive mansion with the pool and the hot tub. Even though John was a very modest man who hated showing off his wealth, Lead began to form a theory. John was scheduled to sign the final divorce and custody papers on Thursday morning, which would put an end to Michelle's ability to demand more money. Furthermore, John was refusing to take her calls, and he had a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy. Michelle had a massive financial motive to want John dead before he signed those papers. But Michelle was a relatively small woman, and John was a strong, healthy man. It seemed highly unlikely that Michelle could have physically overpowered John and stabbed him to death. But Lade thought, what if Michelle did not do it herself? What if she got her new boyfriend, Kevin Foley, to do it for her? Kevin was a state trooper, a large, athletic man who had the physical strength to carry out such a brutal attack. As Lade left the dental office, she knew she had a massive problem. Her prime suspects were now a fellow law enforcement officer and his girlfriend. If she made a move against a state trooper without ironclad proof, it would ruin her career and destroy the case. She needed to be absolutely certain before she made an arrest. On Wednesday, April 19th, John Yelnick's funeral was held. The community was in mourning, and John's family was becoming increasingly angry and vocal about the lack of progress in the case. They could not understand why the police had not arrested anyone yet. They knew John had been terrified for his life before he was killed, and they felt like the police were failing him. But Lead remained disciplined. For the next several months, she continued her slow, methodical investigation. She followed up on every single rumor, tip, and lead that came into the station. She systematically ruled out other potential suspects, all while keeping a very close eye on her 3 main persons of interest: Tom Hughes, Michelle Yelnick, and State Trooper Kevin Foley. But she did not make any moves to arrest them. The pressure on Lead reached a boiling point in the summer of 2006, about 3 months after the murder. She received a phone call from Melissa Hughes, who told her that she wanted to meet at John's house immediately. When Lead arrived at the property, she was shocked to find Melissa standing on the front sidewalk with 2 older women. Melissa introduced them as the Psychic Sisters. She explained that she had met them at a local psychic tea party and that they had experienced powerful visions about John's murder. Lade was incredibly annoyed. She did not believe in psychics, and she felt like this was a complete waste of her time. But then, Melissa revealed that John's family had actually given the psychics permission to enter the house. Led knew she had to play along to keep the family happy and buy herself more time, so she reluctantly followed them inside. The house had not been cleaned since the murder, and the walls and floors were still stained with dried blood. The Psychic Sisters walked through the rooms, dramatically waving their hands and claiming to feel hot and cold patches in the air. They eventually stopped in the dining room and claimed that the murder had started right there. They said they saw a knife, a bloody footprint, and a red or black car parked outside. Then they looked at Melissa and declared that her husband, Tom Hughes, was completely innocent. Lead did her best to keep from rolling her eyes. The bloody crime scene was highly publicized, and anyone who read the newspapers knew about the knife, the bloody footprints, and the suspected timeline. The fact that these psychics, who were hired by Melissa, had completely exonerated Melissa's husband was not convincing at all. But Lead realized that the psychics had actually done her a favor. By giving the family some sense of hope and closure, they had taken some of the intense public pressure off her back, allowing her to keep working quietly. But Lead's time finally ran out in February of 2007, nearly 10 months after John's murder. John's family had completely lost faith in the Blairsville Police Department. They made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, begging them to step in and take over the investigation. The Attorney General agreed, and the local police department was ordered to hand over all of their files. Lade was devastated. This was exactly what she had feared from the very beginning. She was losing her first major homicide case, and she felt like all of her hard work was about to be thrown away, but then Lead realized that this was actually the perfect opportunity to play her final secret card. She went to the evidence refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and pulled out the container containing John's fingernail clippings and tissue samples that had been sitting there for nearly a year. Under normal circumstances, Lade would have been forced to send these samples to the state police crime lab. But Lade had been terrified to do that. She knew that Kevin Foley was a state trooper, and she was deeply paranoid that his colleagues at the state lab might accidentally contaminate, lose, or cover up the evidence to protect one of their own. She did not trust the state police to investigate themselves. But now, because the Attorney General's office was taking over, the case had become a major statewide investigation. This gave Lead the authority to bypass the state police entirely. She repackaged the fingernail clippings and sent them directly to the federal level, straight to the FBI crime lab in Washington, D.C. The FBI did not normally accept evidence from small-town murder cases, but because of the high-profile nature of this investigation, they agreed to test the samples. For several weeks, Lade waited in agony. She knew that if the FBI found nothing, or if she had compromised the evidence by keeping it in a standard refrigerator for 10 months, she would likely face criminal charges for withholding evidence. But then the email from the FBI crime lab arrived. Lade sat at her computer, clicked on the email, and began to read. As her eyes scanned the document, she let out a gasp of pure shock. Her incredibly risky plan had worked perfectly. The FBI had successfully extracted foreign DNA from underneath John Yelnick's fingernails. And when they ran it through their database, they found an absolute undeniable match. Based on the physical evidence and the forensic testing, investigators were finally able to reconstruct exactly what happened to Dr. John Yelnick in the early morning hours of April 13, 2006. Around 12:30 in the morning, a red sedan drove slowly down the quiet, dark residential street where John lived. The car pulled up to the curb and the driver turned off the headlights. A large man climbed out of the vehicle and looked around to make sure the street was completely empty. It was a cold spring night and all of the neighbors were asleep. The man walked quietly around to the back of John's house, stepped onto the rear porch, and tried the doorknob. The back door was unlocked. The man pushed it open and slipped inside the warm, dark house. He walked quietly through the dining room and stepped into the living room. There, he saw John Yelnick fast asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. The man reached into his jacket, pulled out a sharp, single-edged knife, and gripped the handle tightly. He walked right up to the sleeping dentist, raised the blade high into the air, and brought it down with massive force. John instantly woke up in absolute agony. He began to scream at the top of his lungs, a terrifying sound that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. John immediately put his hands up to defend himself, grabbing at the blade and clawing desperately at his attacker's face and arms. As John fought for his life, his fingernails dug deep into the killer's skin, ripping away tiny flesh and skin cells that would eventually be trapped under his nails. John rolled off the couch, desperate to get away, but the killer pursued him, repeatedly stabbing and slashing at his back and neck. During the chaotic struggle, they crashed into the coffee table, sending the stack of custody documents flying across the room. John, fueled by pure adrenaline, managed to break free for a split second and ran toward the front door, trying to escape into the safety of the street. John reached the front foyer and grabbed the doorknob, but the killer was right behind him. The killer shoved John violently from behind. John lost his balance and fell forward, his head smashing directly through the small glass panel next to the door. A large, jagged shard of broken glass pierced deep into the side of his neck, severing his jugular vein. John collapsed onto the floor, and within minutes he bled to death. The killer stood over John's body, watching until he was completely motionless. He then walked back through the house, leaving a trail of bloody shoe prints behind him, and slipped out the back door. The killer was completely confident that he would never be caught. He was a highly trained law enforcement officer, and he believed he had committed the perfect crime. He believed his colleagues would protect him, and that the local police were too incompetent to solve it. The killer was Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. Kevin had been dating Michelle Yelnick for months, and he had listened to her endless complaints about John. He had come to absolutely despise the dentist, especially after Michelle's false accusations of child abuse. Kevin believed that John was an abuser who was ruined Michelle's life, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. He also knew that if John was dead, Michelle would inherit millions of dollars in life insurance, which would set them up for a very comfortable life together. Corporal Janelle Lead's intuition and her daring decision to hide the evidence in the station refrigerator had saved the entire case. Because she did not trust the state police to run a fair investigation on one of their own, she had kept the DNA safe until she could get it into the hands of the FBI. Kevin Foley was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During his trial, the defense argued that the DNA evidence had been mishandled and should be thrown out because it had been kept in a standard refrigerator for 10 months. But the prosecution presented testimony from FBI scientists who confirmed that the DNA was perfectly preserved and was an absolute match to Foley. The prosecution also presented evidence of the bloody shoe prints, which matched the exact size and brand of athletic shoes that Kevin Foley owned. In the end, the jury found Kevin Foley guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite her clear financial motive and her constant demands for money, Michelle Yelnick was never charged with any crime in connection with her husband's murder. As prosecutors did not have enough evidence to prove she had helped plan the attack, John's family was finally able to find some sense of peace, knowing that the man who had brutally taken his life was behind bars. And the small town of Blairsville would never forget the brave, methodical female detective who was willing to risk her entire career to make sure a killer cop did not get away with murder. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.